Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Cathara 7 did not believe in warnings. The planet had, over the course of its geological history, developed a relationship with its own atmosphere that could charitably be described as volatile and uncharitably described as personally vindictive. And the colonization surveys had noted this in the same bland bureaucratic tone, used to note surface mineral compositions and average daylight hours, as though the fact that the sky could turn lethal in under 4 minutes was a logistical footnote rather than a condition of survival. The surveys had been written by people who had visited Cathara 7 briefly and left quickly, which explained a great deal about their tone. Sael had read the surveys. She had also read the supplementary cultural orientation materials produced by the Vethani Interplanetary Exchange Program, which described Cathara 7 weather patterns as dynamically variable, a phrase so carefully chosen that it could only have been written by someone who had nearly died in a Catharan storm, and decided afterward that the experience was someone else's problem to communicate. She had filed both documents under review and had proceeded to spend the first 3 rotational cycles of her posting, doing what most new arrivals did, which was looking at the amber sky and thinking it was beautiful. She was not looking at it and thinking it was beautiful now. Now she was running. The transition had taken, by her best estimate, approximately 90 seconds. One moment, the outer path between the Eastern Transit Hub and the residential tier had been bathed in that particular pale amber light that the settlement's older residents would later tell her was the planet's way of lulling you into complacency before it made its actual feelings known. The next moment the temperature had dropped with the sudden, physical conviction of a door being slammed, and the air above her had cracked open with an electrical discharge so massive and so close that she felt the ionization on the surface of her skin and tasted something metallic and wrong. The bioluminescent traces along her temples flared white. Her neural processing spiked the way it spiked in crowded rooms, that familiar overloaded brightness, except there was nothing to read here, no emotional field generating the response, just her own body, alarmed, communicating its alarm in the only language it had. The second discharge came before she had finished processing the first. The rain followed the second discharge with no grace period whatsoever. She tried the first HAB unit she reached. The outer panel was dark, sealed to emergency-only override, and her exchange program credentials were insufficient for emergency override of a private residence, a fact she registered with the particular quality of frustration reserved for bureaucratic obstacles encountered during physical danger. She tried the second, also sealed. She was moving again before the panel finished its rejection cycle, because standing still in a Catharan electrical storm while possessing a body full of conductive neural tissue was the kind of decision that removed itself from the list of available options very quickly. The third HAB had a light on inside. More importantly, its outer panel carried the small green indicator that meant open emergency protocol, the settlement charter requirement that all residential units remain accessible to shelter seekers during active weather events. She had, in 11 rotational cycles, never needed to use it. She had thought of it approximately the way she thought of the emergency pressure sealant in her survey kit. Theoretically important, practically never relevant, the kind of provision that existed to make the settlement's liability documentation feel complete. She hit the panel with the heel of her hand, and the door opened immediately, and she came through it with the full momentum of someone who had been running in the rain on a planet that was currently attempting something homicidal, and she brought with her a considerable quantity of Cathara 7 weather. And she stopped just inside because the warm air hit her, and because the room hit her, and because standing in the kitchen area of this small and inexplicably lived-in HAB unit was a human man holding a mug, looking at her with the expression of someone whose afternoon had just expanded in a direction they had not anticipated, but were, apparently, prepared to accommodate. He said, "Are you hurt?" Sael stood in the doorway and dripped on his floor and felt the room go quiet. Not quiet the way empty rooms were quiet. She knew that quiet, the low residual hum of old imprints, furniture that had absorbed years of someone's evenings. This was something else. This was the absence of the thing she had carried since she was old enough to understand that other people were loud in ways they didn't know about. Loud in ways she couldn't explain to them without watching their faces do the careful, sympathetic thing that meant they understood the words but not the weight. The human was standing 3 meters away, and his presence in her psychometric awareness was nothing. He was a silence wearing a thermal underlayer and an expression of practical concern, and the contradiction between how intensely, physically there he was, the particular gravity of him, the warm specific reality of a person occupying a space, and the complete absence of any emotional field registering in her neurology was so abrupt and so total that she simply stood there for a moment longer than was socially conventional. Processing it, he glanced briefly at her temples, then back to her face. "You're glowing a bit," he said, with the tone of someone who had decided that honesty, delivered gently, was more useful than pretending not to notice. Should I be concerned about that, or is it more of a you situation?" A pause. "I'm asking because I'd like to help if helping is an option, not because it bothers me. It's actually, if I'm being honest, the nicest thing that's happened in this kitchen all week." Outside, the storm hit the settlement wall, with the sound of a large and very committed argument. Inside, Sael looked at the human, and the quiet held. The human's name was Davin Orel, and he delivered this information with the same practical efficiency with which he produced a thermal wrap from a storage panel, a sequence of actions so smooth it suggested he had a mental checklist titled Unexpected Visitor Protocols that he had, at some prior point in his life, actually thought through. Name, blanket, hot drink pending. Sael filed this away with the involuntary precision of someone whose professional training had made observation a reflex, and accepted the thermal wrap, and sat on the edge of the long seat near the window because standing in the middle of someone else's space while dripping on their floor had a social expiration point she felt she had already exceeded. Outside, Cathara 7 continued its atmospheric event with the energy of something that had been saving up. The window transmitted the sound of it in low, structural frequencies, the kind of sound that didn't enter through the ears so much as through the floor and the walls and the base of the spine. She had been in the hab for 4 minutes and 20 seconds by her internal count, and the quiet had not diminished. She had been checking it the way she checked uncertain surfaces, carefully, with her attention split between the test and the exit, and it continued to hold with a consistency that was beginning to shift, in her neurological assessment of the situation, from anomaly to property. The property of him. Of this particular human, standing at his kitchen surface doing something practical with a heating unit, and talking to her in the easy, undemanding way of someone who had decided that the most useful thing he could do for a startled stranger was act as though nothing about the situation required more tension than it already contained. He was asking about her work, not intrusively, the way you ask someone about their work when you are genuinely curious but have the social awareness to make the question feel like an offering rather than a demand. Cultural survey adjunct, she told him. She explained the exchange program in the condensed version she gave at professional functions. Vethani cultural presence embedded in multi-species settlements, documenting integration patterns, identifying friction points before they calcified into something harder to address. He listened with the specific quality of attention that she had learned to distinguish from the performance of listening, which most beings did in social situations, while actually processing their own next contribution. He was simply receiving what she said. It was, she found, unusual enough to be slightly disorienting. "So you spend a lot of time in crowded places," he said, "reading how different species are getting along." "Yes." "And your neurology means you're also receiving everyone's emotional field while you do that." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone doing arithmetic. That seems like a job designed by someone who had never met a Vithani. Sael looked at him. Her neural traces, she was aware, had done the brightening thing again, not the overloaded flicker of overstimulation, but the steady luminosity that accompanied processing something she found genuinely interesting. The program was designed collaboratively, she said, by a committee of 12. There were no Vithani on the committee. A pause. There are 2 of us in the program. We have discussed this. What do they say when you raise it? They say our unique perceptual abilities make us exceptionally well-suited to the work. She delivered this with the flatness of a phrase repeated so many times it had worn smooth, which is accurate. It is also the same logic by which you might say someone who cannot stop hearing is exceptionally well-suited to monitoring a very loud room. Davin set the mug down in front of her and sat across from her with his own, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "That is genuinely the most politely devastating description of a workplace problem I've ever heard." Something in Sael's chest loosened slightly, in the way that things loosen when you say a true thing out loud, and someone receives it as true rather than as complaint. She picked up the mug. The contents were warm and made an attempt at being comforting that was, as he had promised, only partially successful, but partial success in warmth was still warmth, and warmth on Cathara 7 during an electrical storm was not a thing to be ungrateful for. "It is not a complaint," she said, which was something she told herself regularly and only sometimes believed. "I didn't think it was," he said. "I think it's an observation. There's a difference." She looked at him across the small, cluttered table, in the kitchen of the hab where the storm was loud against every wall, and the interior was, against all reasonable expectation, the quietest place she had stood in recent memory. He was watching her with the patient, uncomplicated attention of someone who had asked a question and was genuinely interested in the answer, and his presence registered in her psychometric awareness as it had from the first moment, not as noise, not as silence in the hollow sense, but as the particular quiet of a space that had been carefully kept. Like a room someone had chosen to leave simple. Like a frequency her neurology had no prior category for and was now, with focused and somewhat startled attention, beginning to build one. Outside, the storm made itself known again. Neither of them moved. The not quite soup arrived approximately 40 minutes into the storm, produced from a combination of shelf-stable components that Davin assembled with the focused pragmatism of someone who had decided that feeding a guest was a problem he could actually solve. Unlike the weather, the atmospheric modeling failures of Cathara 7, or the broader logistical circumstances that had deposited a Vithani cultural adjunct into his kitchen on a Tuesday. He said it in front of her with the honesty he'd already demonstrated was his default mode. "It's trying," he said. "I want you to know it's genuinely trying." And she received this, and the bowl, and found that the trying was in fact evident and that the result was better than the warning had implied. She told him so. He looked quietly pleased in the way she was beginning to identify as characteristic, not performed gratification, but the small, real satisfaction of someone who had attempted a practical thing and had it land. They had been talking for nearly an hour by then, not with the directed efficiency of a professional exchange, which was the register Sael most commonly operated in with beings she had recently met, but in the more irregular way of 2 people finding the edges of each other's interests and following the ones that went somewhere. He knew a considerable amount about Vithani neurology, more than most non-Vithani she had encountered, and in a different way, less oriented toward the cultural sensitivity bullet points that the exchange program distributed to settlement residents, and more oriented toward the actual mechanisms. The specific question of how psychometric processing integrated with standard sensory function, whether the 2 systems ran in parallel or whether they were more fundamentally intertwined than that. She answered him. She answered him at more length than she had intended, because the questions were precise enough to deserve precise answers, and because she found, with some surprise, that she was not performing the careful brevity she usually applied to discussions of her own neurology with non-Vethani, the brevity that functioned as a lid on the topic, keeping it from becoming too much of her. At some point she told him about the Dorinthian station. She noticed, as previously noted, that she had not decided to tell him this. It had simply emerged in the way that things emerge when a conversation has developed enough trust to make the next true thing available. He had listened without interrupting, which was not universal, and had said at the end that it sounded like trying to have a conversation in a room where everyone who had ever lived there was still shouting. And she had said yes, exactly that. And the precision of the translation had done something to the quality of the quiet in the room, added a layer to it. The way a room becomes different after someone in it has said a true thing, and it has been correctly received. "Can I ask," he said, with the preliminary phrasing he used when a question was edging into territory he wanted to flag before entering, "whether the absence of my absence, specifically, is uncomfortable? I'm aware that unusual can be unpleasant even when it isn't bad, and I have no reference point for how this registers." She considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved. "It is not uncomfortable," she said. "It is disorienting. There is a distinction. Like the difference between a room being dark and a room having the lights off." She turned this over. "More like," she said slowly, "having a sound in your ears from birth that you have categorized as permanent, and then one day it stops. The stopping is not painful, but you keep waiting for it to come back because you have no prior experience of its absence, and the waiting itself takes a form of attention." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm shifted register, moving from its peak argument frequency into something that was still loud but had the quality of a thing beginning to consider resolution. "Are you still waiting for it to come back?" "Less," she said, "than I was 20 minutes ago." He nodded, in the way of someone receiving information and updating their model without making a production of the update, and said, "For what it's worth from my side, you're the second Vethani I've had a sustained conversation with, and you're considerably easier to talk to than the first one." "Who was the first?" "A xenobiology postdoc on my previous station. Very brilliant. Absolutely no interest in any topic that wasn't his specific subfield, and the subfield was the mating behavior of pressure-adapted microfauna, so the conversational range was." He paused. "Limited." "Did you learn a great deal about pressure-adapted microfauna?" "I learned," Davin said, with the gravity of someone reporting genuine trauma, "more than I will ever be able to forget." Sael felt the thing in her chest that she had recently identified as the early form of ease. Ease being a state she associated primarily with solitude, and occasionally with the company of her sister, who was the only person in her family who had inherited the full-spectrum psychometric sensitivity, and therefore required no explanation of any of it, ever. The fact that she was now identifying a version of it here, in the company of a human she had known for 58 minutes, in a hab on a planet that had just tried to electrocute her, was information she was sitting with carefully. The way you sit with any information that has the potential to revise a prior assumption you'd believed was structural. She had assumed, without examining the assumption, that ease required absence. Absence of others, absence of their psychometric weight, the relief of a field that wasn't hers. What she was experiencing now was not absence. He was present, more present, in the physical, spatial, attentional sense, than most people managed to be in her experience, which skewed toward beings who were loud in one register and dim in another. He was present and he was quiet, and the combination was not something she had filed under any existing category, which meant her neurology was doing the work of building a new one. And the work felt, from the inside, less like effort than like something opening. Her comm unit registered a message from her station supervisor. She glanced at it, then at him, then back at the storm which was still conducting itself outside with diminishing but persistent conviction. "Everything all right?" he asked. "My supervisor," she said, "wants to know if I'm alive." "Are you?" She considered this with more genuine attention than the question technically required. "More than I was," she said, which was not the answer she had intended to give and was, she found, completely accurate. The all-clear came from Cathara 7 atmospheric monitoring system at the precise moment Sael had stopped actively waiting for it, which felt, in retrospect, like the planet making a small philosophical point. The notification arrived on both their comm units simultaneously, a dual chime in the quiet of the hab that neither of them moved to acknowledge immediately. The way two people in a conversation sometimes let a door knock go unanswered for one more sentence, and then one more after that, because the sentence is still going somewhere. They had been talking for 4 hours and 11 minutes. She knew the exact figure because the monitoring system's all clear included a timestamp, and because she had a professional habit of tracking elapsed time in unfamiliar environments, a habit that had originally developed as a coping mechanism for crowded spaces. Knowing how long she'd been inside a psychometrically loud room gave her a measure of control over when she left it. She had never before reached the end of a social encounter and found that the tracking had become something other than a countdown. 4 hours and 11 minutes had passed and she was not, by any metric she was accustomed to applying, depleted. This was, to put it with clinical understatement, new data. She confirmed to her supervisor that she was alive. She did this from the kitchen table, composing the message with the comm unit in one hand and the last of the not-quite soup in the other, and her supervisor replied within seconds with a message that read confirmed alive. "The Hathori pressure data still needs your sign-off. Also, there is a follow-up welfare check protocol I'm supposed to send you, but I think we can agree it's answered. Please be back for morning brief." She signed off on the Hathori data without reading it, which was professionally questionable and practically fine, because she had reviewed the underlying survey herself 3 days prior, and the numbers were correct. She was aware that she was delaying departure by generating small tasks. She was aware that she was aware of this, and that the awareness was not producing the departure. Davin was washing the bowls with the unhurried efficiency of someone who washed bowls the same way whether or not anyone was watching, which she had come to understand, over 4 hours and 11 minutes, was consistent with how he did most things. He had a quality of being the same in all directions. The same practical, quietly attentive version of himself, whether he was making an uncomfortable drink or explaining xenobiological pressure calibration, or asking a careful question about Vethani neurology, with the specific delicacy of someone who had decided that precision was kinder than approximation. She had met beings who were consistent in this way before. She had not previously noticed how rare it was until she encountered it in a context where her psychometric noise floor was 0, and she was reading him entirely through the things he actually did. This was, she had concluded sometime during the 3rd hour, the most interesting thing about the silence he generated. She had spent her life knowing people the way weather is known, by what it did to the air around you before it arrived, by the field it generated, by the resonance of its emotional output in her neurology. She had thought of this as knowing. She understood now, with the clarity that only comes from a direct counterexample, that it was more like being told about a place than going there. With Davin, she was going. She was learning his edges through actual contact, through the accumulation of the things he said, and the things he chose not to say, and the questions he asked, and the ones he flagged before asking. And the process was slower than psychometric knowing, and required her sustained attention in a way that psychometric knowing never had. She found that she did not experience the slowness as a deficiency. She experienced it as the difference between a summary and a story. The story took longer. The story was where the actual thing was. She stood, and the standing had the quality of a decision that had been made slightly before she made it, the body moving ahead of the official announcement. He turned from the sink, and she said she should go, and he said the paths would be wet for another hour at least, which was true, and which they both understood was not an argument for staying, merely a fact being offered in the vicinity of a departure to be received or not as she chose. She chose to receive it as what it was, not pressure, just presence, and said that she was aware of the path conditions and had adequate footwear, which was also true, and he said, "Of course you do. You're a professional," with the faint, dry warmth that she had catalogued as his humor register, the one that operated by understatement and relied on the other person to complete the circuit, and she felt the circuit complete in her chest with a small, precise warmth that had nothing to do with the not quite soup. He told her the emergency panel worked from both sides. She had been in the process of moving toward the door, and she stopped, not dramatically, just with the small pause of someone updating their map of the terrain. He said it in the same practical register as everything else, not as a declaration, not as an invitation she was required to decline or accept on the spot, just as a fact about the door. An architectural note about a hab on Kethara 7 that happened to also be a note about him, and about whatever this 4 hours and 11 minutes had been, and about the 6 days that stood between now and the next time the planet's temper turned lethal. She was a cultural survey adjunct. She was professionally trained to identify the moment when information carried more than its literal content. She noted the moment. She filed it under a category she was creating in real time, which she had not yet named but which felt important enough to name carefully, and therefore worth taking the time to get right. "I'll note that," she said, which landed, she could see, as exactly what it was. She went out into the aftermath of the storm. The settlement was conducting its post-weather inventory in the way of small communities that have long practice with sudden damage, practical, slightly resigned, with the undertone of people who have made peace with living somewhere that requires this of them regularly. The paths were wet. The sky had returned to its amber default, the color she had once thought was beautiful, and now thought was beautiful and suspicious in equal measure, which was perhaps a more honest relationship with a sky than she had been managing before. The psychometric field of the settlement came back to her as she walked, the hum and press of hundreds of people in close proximity, the ambient noise of lives being conducted at a volume she had never been able to turn down. She walked through it. She had walked through it every day for 11 rotational cycles, and she would walk through it tomorrow and the day after and the 4 days after that. The noise was the same. Something in the quality of her relationship to it was not. It was not gone. It was not quieter. But it had a border now, in a way it hadn't this morning, the clear perimeter of a thing that was not everything. A thing that stopped at the door of a specific hab unit where the emergency panel worked from the inside, and a human stood in a kitchen, generating no psychometric field whatsoever, and asking whether she was hurt with the unhurried competence of someone who had considered the question and meant it. She had come inside to escape a storm. The storm was over. She was already thinking about the next one.